Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I'm here today to give you my review of the Sony 85mm F1.4 G Master lens. Now, the GM or G Master series was developed specifically because there was some complaints from Sony users that had begun to adapt the Sony FE platform and noted that there wasn't a lineup of truly premium options that would compete with, say, Canon's L series or, the equivalent series on Nikon. And so the GM series was developed specifically with the mind of creating these premium options, often very expensive, but often is at the same time, optically superior as well. Now, of course, there's a certain amount of marketing hype that's a part of that. Part of that marketing was that they're designed to, resolve 100 megapixels. Frankly, I think that a lot of that does boil down to marketing. Either a lens is sharp or it is not. And, as you increase resolution, things do change, but I've found that lenses that are less sharp on lower resolution bodies are actually in some cases sharper and have more apparent resolution on higher resolution bodies. So I think that's mostly marketing, but at the same time, certainly one thing is true, and that is on my 42 megapixel Sony A7R Mark III, this lens resolves a whole lot. And of course, I'm looking forward to looking at how some of these lenses hold up on the soon coming A7R Mark IV, which moves up to the 61 megapixel range. And so, as many of you know, I've spent an extensive time comparing the G Master lens with 5 other 85mm competitors. And beyond that, I've also reviewed multiple 85mm manual focus lenses for the Sony FE platform. So at this point, in total, I've spent time with 8 different 85mm options, along with several adapted lenses on the Sony FE platform. So I have a pretty good benchmark to work against. And so first of all, let's take a look at the build and the design of this lens. This lens, as I noted in an episode where I compared it with others, this is a lens that in many ways has the most premium build of any of the current 85mm options. It's solid, it's heavy, it's a mix of engineered plastics and metals, but it has a fairly dense feel to it that often denotes, a lot going on underneath the hood. And certainly when it comes to the feature set, it has got by far the most robust set of features. What I mean by that is that it gives you an option, and it's the only one of the autofocusing lenses to do so, of either choosing your aperture via automatic control from within the camera. You just slide it over to A, and then you also have the option of using a manual aperture ring with 1/3 click detents, 1/3 stop detents. I personally enjoy having a manual aperture ring, and when I have a lens like this, I tend to use it. I have, for example, the Sony 50mm F1.4 Sony Zeiss planar, and it is similarly equipped, and I tend to use the manual aperture ring over auto aperture for the simple reason that it's right there and I'm more intentional about it. Of course, your mileage may vary, but one other trick that's up the sleeve here of the G Master lens is it also has a one-click ability to declick that aperture, and it becomes then completely smooth, which if you're a video shooter allows you to do things obviously like aperture racking, or if you're just someone who prefers to not have fixed stops and just to be able to essentially create the aperture shape that you want, then you can do so by using that aperture ring. Now, I will note that while this will move smoothly, or when you have it clicked, you can feel the clicks, the aperture iris, as I'm holding it right now, doesn't actually change. It requires the camera to be engaged and on, and it's still electronically controlled. It just gives you a physical control to do so. So, a little bit different than, say, the Loxia 85mm f2.4, which of course you have a true manual control, fully manual control over the aperture iris. Now, when it comes to the aperture iris here, one thing that stood out to me about the GM as I compared it to all these other lenses is the fact that it has the highest aperture blade count, 11 I believe, and it retains a more circular aperture shape when stopped down than any of the other competing lenses. It also exhibits the best geometry, and what I mean by that is that one thing that people complain about often with a lot of lenses is that near the edges of the frame, when you have, bokeh circles in the background, they'll become lemon-shaped or cat-eye shaped along the edges. The G Master is actually the best of the 6 lenses that I reviewed in this comparison series to retain good geometry towards the edge of the frame. And so that certainly is an advantage. And when you stop the lens down, it retains a really nicely circular shape. So if that's kind of a big deal to you, then the G Master is certainly the way to go. Now, it also has, only a few of them have this, but it's one that does, and that is a manual switch for autofocus and manual focus. It is a focus by wire. It employs dual linear motors to drive the elements. But right here you can see that I can freely turn this. Although it's damped, I can freely turn it without any kind of limits in either direction. And that is because right now it's not doing anything. When the lens is mounted on the camera and the camera is powered on and it's in the appropriate mode, manual focus here or DMF selected in the body. When I turn the focus ring, it will route input through the focus motor and it will turn the elements. Now, many of you have heard me complain that, focus by wire is not my favorite manual focus experience, and that remains true. I will note that on some of these lenses, like the GM, they've done a pretty good job of emulating manual focus. And so while it's not, a true like Zeiss manual focus experience or Voigtlander, some of the really, really well-made manual focus lenses, it certainly is better than what most, say, Canon L series USM motors are when they're clicked into MF mode. Sometimes there's a little bit of a slightly gritty feel, or it's not completely damped and smooth. The G Master does a pretty good job when it comes to that. However, when you're making major focus changes, you're going to make a lot of rotations, usually about 3 or 4 full rotations to go from each one limit to the other. And so don't plan on making really big, fast manual focus changes. Of course, most of the time you're not going to be utilizing manual focus. This is an autofocus lens and it autofocuses very well. In my comparison test, it came in third place when it came to tracking action. But while it came in third place because of some notable misses by the metric that I use, what I did is I took the burst, 40-something images per burst, and then I broke down at a pixel level. I looked at each one of them and I rated it 1 to 5. And so an image that received a 5 was one that was perfectly focused. One that received a 1 was one that was completely defocused or misfocused. And so the G Master actually had the highest number of perfectly focused images out of all the 6 lenses. But unfortunately, what brought its score down somewhat is that it had some really bad misses as well. And what that tended to be is either getting well before the plane of focus with my subject, which was a sprinter sprinting towards the camera. And so it would either get well out in front of the subject to where the subject was completely out of focus, or it would be well behind. It was just kind of this pulse that would happen. It happened for about 4 images. And so it wasn't like a routine thing, but it happened and that brought the score down. However, in general purpose use, my autofocus accuracy was really, really high. I shot event settings really, really high. Outside of that, my only complaint about, just regular autofocus was there was a few situations where I wanted to focus on, a foreground object and it would lock onto a background object and just refused of its own devices to come back. I would try to reinitiate focus by just, holding the shutter button down halfway. Wouldn't do it. And so I either had to do a manual focus to pull it back to where I wanted, or to point maybe at the ground or something at about the right distance to get the focus pulled back, and then a lot of times it would pick up. The only other thing that's worthy of note here is that when we evaluate the autofocus smoothness for video work, as you're going to see here, it leaves a little bit to be desired.
Sony 85mm G Master.
What you can see there's certainly some noise. In fact, it was, out of the 6 lenses that I reviewed, it was arguably the noisiest, competing with the Sigma 85mm F1.4 art as the, or 1.4 art as the noisiest. It also had some very obvious stepping that took place. So if you were making a more significant focus change, you would have kind of a focus about halfway, split-second pause, and then the remainder of the focus. And so there were other lenses that did a better job of just doing one, clean focus pull. And so, the focus motor gets the job done. However, it, compared to, example, the 85mm F1.8, it just feels a little bit less refined than that, a little less snappy, a little less responsive. And that's the nature of those, those linear motors needing a lot more torque to move the much larger, heavier elements that make up an F1.4 lens. Now, when it comes to the image quality, the G Master is, it lags a little bit behind the Sigma Art series in the corners, and that it's very, very strong in the center, very, very high contrast, and we'll get back to that in just a second. But the Art lens actually has the strongest corners, and it's very, very consistent across the frame. Stop down a little bit, however, to say f2.8, the GM makes far more significant improvements than what the Sigma does. The Sigma is very good wide open, but it only makes really incremental improvements, very tiny improvements when stopped down. That's not true of the G Master, and by f2.8, it actually is sharper in the corners and has more contrast. And so at, smaller apertures, probably beginning at somewhere around f2.8, it is the highest resolving of the lenses that I evaluated. And it has the highest levels of micro contrast of any of the lenses. And so where I saw that, like for example, I really love the Samyang 85mm F1.4 AF lens for Sony. It has, to me, a really, really nice mix of sharpness, but also having a nice, soft, creamy, defocused area, or bokeh. The GM is arguably a little less soft in the defocused area, but what it does pack is definitely more micro contrast and global contrast. And so at wider apertures, say when shooting a portrait, you're going to see more nuance in the variations of skin tone, light and shadow on the face. So brighter areas will be a little bit brighter, darker areas a little bit darker. It's a taste thing as to what you prefer, but certainly if your priority is shooting really high resolution, very high contrast images, the GM is the best of the bunch and is probably more akin to like a Zeiss Milvus 85mm kind of look in terms of its impact. And so, certainly a lot of strengths when it comes to that. And so, it really breaks down to what your priorities are. It doesn't have any kind of fatal flaws. It does show a little bit of chromatic aberration in terms of longitudinal variety, mostly exhibited as a little bit of a blue-green fringing in bokeh circles or slightly beyond the plane of focus. Not strong enough to be a major issue, however. It does have some vignette wide open, but the vignette is not particularly strong, particularly when compared to competitors. Although the Sigma Art, which has a huge 86mm front element, it has a little bit, maybe a little bit less vignette in the corners. The one area where I did note that, say, the Samyang beat the GM is that at equivalent distances and equivalent apertures, bokeh circles were larger and softer out of the Samyang. And so I think that there is, one of the factors here is I think that the GM is probably a little bit shy of 85mm. And, that kind of stood out in comparison even to the Sigma as well. And I've always noted the Sigma to maybe be a hair shy of 85mm as well. And so I'm going to guess that this is actually somewhere closer to 83mm. And so that can be a factor in certain situations. But even when stopped down somewhat and at medium distances, the Samyang just had a little bit softer, brighter backgrounds. And maybe light transmission, which has been pretty common for these premium Sony lenses that I've seen, Sony branded, that maybe light transmission is always not top notch. And so I don't think that's the case here. And I think that's part of where they get the, maybe the more intense contrast out. That's maybe the trade-off that comes a part of it. But overall, I mean, the image quality is probably the most consistently great of all of them, but don't expect it to be by a huge margin. The one thing that jumped out to me in my comparison series is that all of those lenses are very, very competent. And while there are strengths and weaknesses, none of them are hugely head and shoulders over the other. In terms of the complete package, the G Master is it. It has the best combination of build, features, and image quality, autofocus. It is, along with the other Sony 85mm, the only ones to have the AF hold button, which you can program to a variety of different functions. And so it's a little bit more feature rich. It's a little bit better built. It's more thoroughly weather sealed probably than any of the competitors. but it's also by far the most premium priced. And so it's going to run you at around $1,800, where the nearest competitors are $1,200, and you can get the the Samyang for under $700. And so that makes a little bit more of a hard sell for those that are looking for value. If you're more just concerned on having the best, it's going to be the most durable in the long term, and you're willing to spend the money, maybe you're a professional or a commercial photographer, probably the G Master is the lens for you. But if you are more of a bargain hunter, note that there are several options that are going to give you nearly as much lens and certainly nearly as much performance for a whole lot less money. I'm Dustin Abbott, and if you look in the description down below, you can find linkage to my full text review along with a lot of supporting photos as a part of that. You can also find buying links if you'd like to purchase one of these bad boys for yourself. There's also linkage there to follow me on social media and to become a patron, and you can sign up for my newsletter. And of course, if you haven't already, please click that subscribe button right here on YouTube. Thanks for watching. Have a great day.